The dinner party in the Upper East Side penthouse was flawless, the kind where the champagne is vintage and the laughter is rehearsed. But as Ethan watched his wife across the room, he noticed her hand wasn't resting on the table. It was beneath it, her fingers dancing on a phone screen with a smile he hadn't seen in years. It's a terrifying moment when you realize the person holding your life together is the one actively dismantling it. If you want to witness the quiet devastation of a man who chooses dignity over a scene and the heavy price of betrayal, stay with me as this story unfolds. The air in the gallery was always kept at a precise 68 degrees, a sterile chill meant to preserve the oil paintings. But tonight, it felt like it was seeping straight into Ethan's marrow. He adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo, standing near a pillar of exposed brick, watching his wife, Elena, work the room. She was radiant. That was the only word for it. In a backless emerald gown that clung to her silhouette, she moved through the crowd of investors and critics like a flame, effortless and consuming. Ethan took a sip of his sparkling water. He was the designated driver, as always, and felt that familiar swell of pride mixed with the dull ache of invisibility. He was the structural engineer. She was the art. He made sure the walls didn't collapse. She made sure they were beautiful. "She's outdoing herself tonight," a voice said beside him. Ethan turned to see Marcus, one of the gallery's board members. "She worked hard for this exhibition, Marcus. The artist is difficult." "Julian," Marcus chuckled, gesturing with his champagne flute toward a man standing near the bar. "Genius usually comes with a side of narcissism." Ethan looked over. Julian was younger, perhaps 28, with messy hair that was carefully styled to look careless, and a suit that cost more than Ethan's first car. He was laughing, his head thrown back, holding court. And then, Elena was there. Ethan watched as she approached Julian. It was a professional setting. There were 100 people in the room. But Ethan saw the shift. He saw the way Elena's shoulders dropped, the tension leaving her body the moment she entered Julian's orbit. It was a subtle, magnetic pull that defied the physics Ethan built his career on. He shouldn't have followed them. When Elena whispered something to Julian and slipped toward the terrace doors for a smoke break, Ethan should have stayed by the pillar. He should have checked his emails. He should have done anything but set his glass down and quietly weave through the crowd, stepping out onto the adjacent balcony, separated from them only by a decorative partition of ivy and frosted glass. The city noise of Soho, distant sirens, the hum of traffic, usually drowned out conversations. But the air was still tonight. "He's going to notice, Elle." Julian's voice drifted through the ivy. Wasn't fearful, it was amused. "Ethan?" Elena's laugh was a sound Ethan used to love. Now it sounded sharp, like glass breaking. "Ethan doesn't notice anything that isn't made of concrete. He's safe. He's furniture, Julian. Necessary but boring." Ethan stood frozen. The cold from the Hudson River wind hit his face, but he didn't blink. "Don't be cruel," Julian said, though his tone suggested he didn't mind. "The man pays for the penthouse." "And that's why I stay." Elena sighed, the sound of a lighter flicking followed by an exhale. "I need the stability so I can have this with you. I'd rather sleep on the floor of a studio apartment than in that king-sized bed with him some nights. He suffocates me with his goodness." Ethan looked down at his hands. They were steady. He waited for the rage. He waited for the urge to storm around the partition, to punch Julian, to scream at Elena, to demand an explanation for the 10 years of loyalty he had poured into her. But nothing came. Instead, A strange, clarifying silence washed over him. It was the same feeling he got when he inspected a building and found a fatal structural flaw in the foundation. You don't yell at the concrete. You don't negotiate with gravity. You simply condemn the structure. The building was unsound. It had to be abandoned. "I have to get back," Elena said, her voice softening into a murmur that implied a touch. "He'll be looking for me to hold his coat soon." "Go," Julian whispered. Ethan turned around. He moved silently, his footsteps absorbed by the heavy atmosphere of the night. He walked back into the gallery, past the waiters, past the art that cost millions, and out the front door. He didn't wait for her. He didn't text. He hailed a yellow cab on West Broadway. "Where to?" the driver asked. "Home," Ethan said. "I have some packing to do." But as the city blurred past the window, Ethan realized he was wrong. He wasn't going to pack. Packing implied he wanted to take something with him. He looked at his reflection in the cab window, a man who had just lost everything, yet felt lighter than he had in years. He wasn't taking a single thing. Not a suit. Not a photo. Not even the anger. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was usually a time for Ethan to decompress, to transition from the chaos of the city to the sanctuary of his home. Tonight, the smooth hum of the machinery felt like a countdown. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the foyer of the penthouse that had featured in Architectural Digest just 6 months prior. It was silent. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the heavy, curated silence of a museum after closing hours. Ethan stepped onto the Italian marble, the click of his dress shoes echoing down the hallway. He didn't turn on the main lights. The ambient glow from the city outside filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long blue shadows across the living room. He walked past the grand piano that Elena rarely played, but insisted they needed for texture. He walked past the custom sofa imported from Milan. Every object in this apartment was a testament to his hard work and her expensive taste. He had built the foundation. She had decorated the cage. He entered the master bedroom. The scent of her perfume, sandalwood and expensive jasmine, lingered in the air, faint but suffocating. Ethan went to the walk-in closet. He stood there for a moment, looking at the rows of his suits, the shirts color-coded by the maid, the shelf of watches. His instinct was to grab a suitcase. A rational man would pack. A rational man would take the vintage Rolex he bought after his first big commission. A rational man would take the cash from the safe. He reached out and touched the sleeve of a charcoal wool coat. It was warm, familiar. But then he remembered her voice on the balcony. "He's furniture. If he took these clothes, if he took the car keys, if he took even a single toothbrush, he would be negotiating the terms of their separation. He would be acknowledging that this life still held value to him." He realized that to truly leave, he couldn't just subtract himself from the equation. He had to zero it out. Ethan withdrew his hand. He stepped back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He checked it. His ID, a single credit card in his own name, and $50 in cash. That was enough. Next, he looked at his left hand. The platinum band felt heavy, a weight he hadn't noticed until this very second. He slid it off. There was a pale band of skin underneath, a ghost of the commitment he had honored for 7 years. He didn't throw it across the room. He didn't smash it. He simply placed it on the center of the bedside table, right next to the lamp. It looked small there. Insignificant. He turned and walked out of the bedroom. He didn't look back. In the kitchen, he placed his set of house keys on the granite island. The metal made a sharp clack against the stone. He took the elevator down. When the doors opened to the lobby, Henry, the night doorman who had known them for 5 years, looked up from his desk with a warm smile. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell. Back early? Is Mrs. Caldwell coming separately?" Ethan paused near the revolving doors. The lobby was warm, gold-lit, safe. Outside, the New York wind was whipping against the glass. "She's not coming, Henry," Ethan said, his voice steady, devoid of any tremor. "And neither am I." "Sir?" Henry looked confused, half rising from his chair. "If anyone asks," Ethan said, pushing the door open, letting the cold air rush in to meet him, "tell them the tenant has vacated." He stepped out onto the sidewalk. He had no coat. The wind cut through his tuxedo jacket, biting and real. He shivered, but for the first time in a decade, the cold didn't bother him. It felt like the first honest thing he had felt all night. Ethan turned right, walking toward the subway station, leaving the skyscrapers behind him. It was nearly 2 a.m. when Elena keyed into the private elevator. The doors opened with a soft hush, and she stepped into the foyer, kicking off her heels immediately. They clattered against the marble, a sharp, irreverent sound that would have usually made her wince, worrying about waking Ethan. But tonight, the apartment felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it was dormant. "Ethan!" she called out. Her voice slightly slurred from the 3 glasses of vintage Krug she'd had after the gallery closed. No answer. She walked into the living room, trailing her fingers along the back of the sofa. She expected to see him sitting in his leather armchair, perhaps reading a schematic on his tablet, ready to offer a passive-aggressive comment about the time. Or maybe he would be in bed, his back turned to the door, feigning sleep. The armchair was empty. The throw blanket was folded with military precision, exactly where the housekeeper had left it that morning. Elena frowned. A flicker of irritation rose in her chest. If he was hiding to make a point, it was childish. She walked to the kitchen island to pour a glass of water and stopped dead. There, sitting on the cold granite, was a set of keys. Ethan's keys. She stared at them. Beside the keys was a small black key fob for the garage and his security pass for the firm. It didn't make sense. Ethan never left without his keys. He was a man of checklists, of pockets padded 3 times before leaving the door. A cold draft seemed to sweep through the room, though the windows were sealed shut. She hurried to the master bedroom, pushing the door open. The bed was made, not a wrinkle on the duvet. It looked like a showroom display, untouched and sterile. Her eyes darted to the nightstand. The lamp was off, but in the moonlight filtering through the blinds, she saw the glint of metal. His wedding band. Elena walked over slowly, the alcohol in her system suddenly turning sour. She picked up the ring. It was cold. There was no note, no angry letter scrawled on legal pad paper, no suitcase half-packed to show he was hesitating. Just the ring and the keys. He was gone. For a moment, panic flared, a sharp, breathless tightness in her chest. But then, as she looked around the expansive room, the panic transmuted into something else. A strange, intoxicating rush of air. He hadn't fought. He hadn't screamed. He had just evaporated. She sat down on the edge of the bed, gripping the ring. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It was over. The guilt, the sneaking around, the exhaustion of pretending to care about structural loads and tensile strength. It was all just gone. She grabbed her phone. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with adrenaline. She dialed Julian. "He's not here," she whispered into the receiver. "What do you mean?" Julian's voice was thick with sleep, or perhaps smoke. "He left, Julian. He left his keys. He left his ring. The apartment. It's ours." 20 minutes later, the buzzer rang. Elena buzzed him up without hesitation. When Julian walked through the door, he looked around the penthouse with a smirk, appreciating the high ceilings, the view of the city, the sheer expense of the air they were breathing. "Nice place," Julian said, dropping his leather jacket onto the floor, right where Ethan would have picked it up. They moved to the bedroom. Elena felt a thrill of transgression as Julian fell onto the bed, disrupting the perfect sheets. But as she lay there later, staring up at the ceiling while Julian slept heavily beside her, the silence returned. It was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't peaceful. It felt vast and hollow. She rolled over, reaching for the glass of water that was usually on her nightstand. The glass Ethan placed there every single night for 7 years. Her hand grasped nothing but empty air. The wind in Chicago was different from New York. In Manhattan, the wind was an annoyance that funneled between skyscrapers. In Chicago, it was a physical assault. It rattled the single-pane windows of the converted warehouse loft Ethan now called home, a constant reminder that he was no longer protected by double-glazed glass and doormen. It had been 365 days since he walked out of the penthouse. Ethan sat at a drafting table that spanned the length of the south wall. The room was sparse, a mattress on the floor, a second-hand coffee machine that hissed violently, and stacks of blueprints that smelled of graphite and ambition. He was thinner now. The softness of the furniture husband had been carved away, replaced by hard angles and a beard he kept trimmed but heavy. He rubbed his eyes, stained with charcoal dust. It was 3 a.m. On the table lay the sketches for The Spire. It wasn't a commission. No firm had asked for it. It was a compulsion. For the first 6 months in Chicago, he had worked low-level freelance jobs, checking load-bearing walls for renovation projects, calculating rebar density for parking garages, just to pay the rent. He had been a ghost in the industry, where he was once a rising star. But at night, he built this. He picked up his pencil, staring at the curvature of the main atrium. In his old life, he would have designed this to be safe. He would have compromised the aesthetic for the sake of easy engineering. But Elena's voice still echoed in the back of his mind, not as a torment, but as fuel. Safe. Boring. Not this time, he muttered to the empty room. He erased a support column. It was a risk. Structurally, it required a cantilever system that was borderline impossible with standard materials. But if he could pull it off, the building wouldn't just stand. It would look like it was floating. It would be terrifying and beautiful. His phone buzzed on the floor beside the mattress. He ignored it. It was likely a creditor or a wrong number. He had changed his number the day he arrived in Illinois and had given it to no one from his past. He hadn't spoken to Elena. He hadn't checked her social media. He didn't know if she was still with Julian, if she had sold the apartment, or if she hated him. He didn't want to know. Indifference was a muscle, and he was training it every day like an athlete. He stood up and walked to the window, wrapping a coarse wool blanket around his shoulders. Below, the L train screeched around a curve, sparks showering down onto the snowy street. The city was gritty, industrial, and alive. It didn't care about his pedigree. It only cared about what he could build. He looked back at the drawing. It was aggressive. It was sharp. It was a structure that refused to apologize for taking up space. For the first time in a year, Ethan felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It was power. He wasn't just designing a building. He was redesigning himself. He walked back to the table, the cold floor biting at his bare feet, and picked up the pencil. He wouldn't sleep tonight. There was too much work to do. The problem with excitement, Elena realized as she stared at the ring of red wine stain on the Italian marble countertop, is that it is impossible to clean up. It was Tuesday morning in Manhattan. Rain lashed against the windows, gray and relentless. Inside the penthouse, the air was stale, smelling faintly of stale cigarette smoke and expensive cologne, Julian's signature scent, which once made her knees weak but now just made her head ache. Elena picked up a sponge. She scrubbed at the wine stain. It wouldn't budge. In the past, the before, the apartment had been a self-sustaining ecosystem. Ethan had systems for everything. The bills were auto-paid. The cleaning service was scheduled. The maintenance of the complex HVAC system was handled before a filter could even think about clogging. Ethan was invisible infrastructure. Now the infrastructure was collapsing. "Do we have any coffee?" Julian's voice drifted from the bedroom, hoarse with sleep. Elena didn't turn around. She kept scrubbing, her knuckles turning white. "You finished it yesterday, Julian. Remember? When you had those potential buyers over?" "Right. Bummer." Julian shuffled into the kitchen. He was wearing boxer briefs and a t-shirt that had a hole in the shoulder. At 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, he looked like a disheveled artist. When they first met, this look was rebellious. Now, it just looked unemployed. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, nuzzling her neck. "Don't be tense, babe. It kills the vibe." Elena stiffened. She pulled away gently, moving to the fridge to check for something, anything, to eat. It was empty, save for a bottle of vodka and a wilting container of arugula. "The maintenance fee is due," Elena said, her voice flat. "And the gallery sales are down this quarter. We need to cut back on the parties." Julian groaned, leaning back against the counter, crossing his arms. "You sound like a banker, El. Money is energy. It flows. You have to spend it to attract it." "Money is math, Julian," she snapped, the words slipping out before she could stop them. They were Ethan's words. He had said that to her 5 years ago when she wanted to buy a ridiculous sculpture. "Money is math, Elena. You can't argue with zero." Julian narrowed his eyes. "You're doing that thing again, comparing me to him. I didn't say his name. You didn't have to. The ghost is loud today." Julian pushed off the counter and walked back toward the bedroom. "I'm going to the studio. The energy in here is toxic." The door slammed. Elena stood alone in the kitchen. The silence that followed wasn't the heavy, pregnant silence of the night Ethan left. It was a dirty silence. It was filled with the noise of unwashed dishes, unpaid bills, and unsaid apologies. She walked to the window. The view of the city was the same, but the glass was streaked. Ethan used to have the window washers come quarterly. She hadn't called them in a year. She pressed her forehead against the cold pane. Down below, yellow cabs moved like corpuscles through the arteries of the city. Somewhere out there, Ethan was existing. Was he struggling? Was he missing her? She doubted it. A terrifying thought took root in her chest, blooming like a dark flower. She had left Ethan because she thought he was holding her back from a vibrant, colorful life. But standing here, amidst the debris of her freedom, she realized the truth. Ethan hadn't been the cage. He had been the ground beneath her feet. And without the ground, She wasn't flying. She was falling. She looked back at the wine stain. It was permanent. She would have to look at it every single day. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest, and for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to weep. Not for the man she lost, but for the woman she was becoming. 3 years is a long time in the life of a city, but it is a lifetime in the trajectory of a career. Ethan stood in the center of the conference room on the 45th floor of the Chicago Tribune Tower. The room was packed. Journalists, critics, and city officials murmured in a low hum that vibrated against the glass walls. The air smelled of expensive coffee and anticipation. Ethan adjusted the microphone. He was 38 now. The gray at his temples was no longer premature. It was distinguished. He wore a suit cut from Italian wool, tailored so sharply it seemed to hold him upright. He didn't look like the man who had walked out of a New York penthouse with nothing but $50. He looked like a man who owned the room. To his right stood the architectural model of the spire. It was a violent, beautiful thing. A tower of glass and steel that didn't just scrape the sky, it seemed to pierce it. It was devoid of ornamentation. It had no softness. It was pure structure, pure engineering, exposed for the world to see. "Mr. Caldwell," a reporter from the Times spoke up, her pen poised. "Your design for the new cultural center has been called aggressive by some critics and revolutionary by others. It's a stark departure from the collaborative work you did in New York. What changed your philosophy?" Ethan looked at the reporter. The flashbulbs popped, blinding white bursts that reminded him of the gala the night he left. But he didn't blink. "I stopped trying to hide the structure," Ethan said, his voice low but carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "For a long time, I believed that a building's strength should be invisible, that the support beams should be covered by drywall and decoration. I was wrong." He placed a hand on the edge of the podium. His fingers were steady. "Structure is the only truth," he continued. "Everything else is just wallpaper. If the foundation is honest, you don't need to dress it up." The room went silent, scribbling furiously. It was a soundbite, a philosophy, a headline. Caldwell's honest steel. Ethan felt a strange detachment. He knew that hundreds of miles away, in New York, this press conference was being live-streamed. He knew that in the art circles where Elena operated, if she still operated there, this news would hit like a shockwave. The furniture husband had just won the Pritzker of the Year, essentially. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, he realized he wasn't doing this for her. He wasn't doing it to prove her wrong. He had simply outgrown the need for her validation. "One last question," another reporter shouted. "The building is named The Spire, but early drafts had the title 0 Point. Why the change?" Ethan paused. He thought about that night in the cab, the moment he realized he had to subtract everything to become something. "Zero implies an ending," Ethan said. "The spire implies a direction, and I only look up." The conference ended in a flurry of applause. Handshakes were offered, firm, respectful grips from men who used to look through him. Ethan navigated the crowd with a new grace. He didn't seek the corner anymore. Later that evening, back in his office, he stood by the window looking out at the Chicago skyline. His phone on the desk lit up. It was a notification from a New York area code, a text message. He didn't know the number, but he knew the rhythm of the vibration. He stared at the screen for a long moment. The old Ethan might have felt a pang of curiosity, a desperate need for closure. The new Ethan simply turned the phone over, face down, and turned back to the window. He had a skyscraper to build. New York City did not forgive weakness, and it certainly did not pause for nostalgia. 5 years after Ethan Caldwell had hailed a cab and vanished, he returned not as a husband, but as a headline. The gala was held in the Temple of Dender at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The massive sandstone temple, illuminated by soft amber lights, stood as a testament to endurance, fitting for a night honoring Ethan's work. Elena stood outside the velvet ropes, clutching a clutch purse that had seen better days. The strap was fraying slightly, a detail she hid under her thumb. It had taken 3 phone calls to old friends who barely remembered her, and a humiliating request to an ex-colleague, just to get a name on the guest list. She wasn't the director anymore. That gallery had closed 2 years ago, a casualty of the economy and her own distracted mismanagement. Julian was gone, having moved on to a younger curator in Berlin the moment Elena's bank account ran dry. She shivered in the autumn chill. The dress she wore was the same emerald gown she had worn the night Ethan left. It used to fit her like a second skin. Now, it hung loosely at her waist. She felt like an imposter in her own life. A black town car pulled up to the curb. The flashbulbs erupted like lightning. Ethan stepped out. Elena's breath hitched. He looked taller. It wasn't physical height. It was the way he held his head. He wasn't scanning the crowd for approval. He wasn't checking to see if she was happy. He was simply there, solid and immovable. He said something to the driver, a faint smile touching his lips, a smile she didn't recognize. It wasn't the eager-to-please grin of the man she married. It was the guarded, confident smile of a man who owed nothing to anyone. He walked up the stairs, bypassing the press with a polite nod, disappearing into the golden warmth of the museum. Elena forced her legs to move. She presented her invitation to the security guard. He scanned it, paused for an agonizing second, and then nodded. "Welcome, Miss Caldwell." The name felt like a theft. She hadn't been a Caldwell in spirit for a long time, only on paper, until the divorce was finalized in absentia. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and money. Waiters circulated with champagne. Elena took a glass, her hand trembling. She downed half of it in one swallow, the bubbles burning her throat. She moved through the crowd, a ghost haunting the edges of the room. She heard snippets of conversation. "The Chicago project is genius." Heard he refused the Pritzker nomination just to make a point. Who is he here with? No one. That's power. She found him near the Egyptian reflecting pool. He was surrounded by a circle of admirers, investors, critics, beautiful women who looked at him with hungry eyes. Ethan was speaking, his hand gesturing towards the stone temple. Elena stepped closer. The noise of the party seemed to fade into a dull roar. She remembered the night on the Chateau balcony. He's furniture. Necessary, but boring. Looking at him now, the center of gravity in the room, she realized how wrong she had been. He hadn't been furniture. He had been the load-bearing wall, and she had taken a sledgehammer to him, thinking the roof would stay up by magic. Ethan turned. It was as if he sensed a disturbance in the air. His gaze swept over the shoulder of a blonde socialite and locked onto Elena. Time seemed to warp. The distance between them was only 20 feet, but it felt like an ocean. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected him to frown. She expected anger. She expected him to look away. He did none of those things. He looked at her with a terrifying stillness. His expression didn't change. The conversation around him continued, but he had gone silent. She took a step forward. This was it. The moment she had replayed in her head 1,000 times in her lonely studio apartment. She would apologize. She would cry. She would beg him to just look at her with something other than this crushing neutrality. Ethan excused himself from the group. He didn't walk away. He turned fully toward her, placing his empty glass on a passing tray. He waited. The gap between them was closing, and with every step, Elena felt the crushing weight of the truth she had been running from. She was the one who had disappeared 5 years ago. Not him. Ethan. Her voice was smaller than he remembered. In his memory, the few times he allowed it to surface, her voice was a command, vibrant and filling the room. Now it sounded brittle, like dried leaves scraping against pavement. Ethan looked down at her. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that the low light of the museum tried to hide. He saw the tremor in her hand as she clutched her purse. He waited for the old reflex, the instinct to comfort her, to ask what was wrong, to fix it. It didn't come. "Elena," he said. His tone was level, the same tone he used for contractors who were behind schedule, polite but detached. "It's been a long time." 5 years, she breathed, searching his face for a crack in the armor. I read about the award, the spire. It's incredible, Ethan. It's exactly what you always wanted to build." "It is," he agreed simply. He didn't offer the thank you. He didn't ask how she had been. He didn't ask about the gallery or the apartment or Julian. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating for her, yet entirely weightless for him. "I made a mistake," Elena blurted out, the words rushing past her lips before she could censor them. The socialite standing nearby glanced over, but Elena didn't care. "Ethan, I was stupid. I was bored and I was selfish, and I didn't know what I had until I woke up in that empty apartment and realized." She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his tuxedo. Ethan didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into the touch either. He looked at her hand on his arm as if it were a foreign object, something that didn't belong in the design. "Elena," he said, interrupting her confession not with malice but with a terrifying calmness. "You don't need to do this." "I do," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes, threatening to ruin her mascara. "I need you to know that I'm sorry. I need you to yell at me, Ethan. Hate me. Please, just feel something." Ethan looked her in the eye. "That's the thing, Elena. I don't hate you. I don't wish you ill. I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for that night on the balcony." He gently removed her hand from his arm. The physical disconnect felt violent in its finality. "But I don't feel anything," he continued softly. "When I left, I took the only thing that mattered to me. My self-respect. Everything else. The furniture, the money, the marriage. I left it all there with you. It's yours to keep." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. If he had screamed, she could have fought back. If he had cried, she could have comforted him. But this was a wall of glass, smooth, cold, and impenetrable. He wasn't punishing her. He had simply erased her. "I have to go," Ethan said, checking his watch. "My partners are waiting." He nodded once, a courteous, stranger's nod, and turned his back. "Ethan!" she choked out, a ragged sound. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He walked through the crowd, the sea of black tuxedos and colorful gowns parting for him. He moved with the easy stride of a man who carried no burdens. Elena stood alone by the reflecting pool. The gala swirled around her. Laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of success. But she was in a vacuum. She looked down at the dark water of the pool and saw her reflection. A woman in a faded green dress, crying in the middle of a party that wasn't hers. Her legs gave way. She sank onto the stone bench behind her, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. It wasn't just the loss of the man. It was the crushing realization of her own irrelevance. Outside on Fifth Avenue, Ethan stepped into the cool night air. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the sharp, gasoline-tinged air of the city. He loosened his tie. He didn't think about the woman crying inside. He thought about steel. He thought about tension and release. He thought about the future. He hailed a cab, opened the door, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look in the rearview mirror as the car pulled away.